Okay, in part two, I'll look at the media and pop culture in a little bit more detail. So I suppose it's important to answer and think about why sociologists want to study these things. In a way, like sociologists are interested in people's lives, so there's a lot of research that goes into things like inequalities and in terms of class and race and gender. Why do we then kind of study these kind of institutions and cultural activities and different things like that? Well, mainly because much of the inequalities that are disseminated in society, many critical sociologists argue are supported by the media and pop culture. So because these things are so central to people's day-to-day lives, their lived experiences, they provide kind of entertainment in terms of their leisure practices, but information in terms of and stuff like that. They become important to how our very cultures function. The multi-billion-dollar industries create lots of employment, but they're really more interesting because they're powerful agents of socialization that we looked at in previous weeks in the course. They impart knowledge, customs, and normative values to everyone, but they're not just they're not necessarily just received as like a sponge without any kind of critical orientation back to them. Media are also important sites of creativity, cultural expression, and artistic endeavour. So media and pop culture are kind of key sites in the way that people practice, and so therefore they're key objects of study in sociology. So just to kind of hark back a little bit to the theoretical traditions that we've looked at a little bit in the course so far, the more functional side of things see that the media plays a key socialising role, allows us to kind of have access to representations of those kind of scripts I was talking about in previous weeks. And if this is done well, it's kind of good for socialisation. It's smooth and consensual, allows society to function that way. From this perspective as well, the media should operate as a kind of watchdog, protecting democracy, informing citizens, attempting to kind of maintain a consensus of values that people can live by. So in this sense, media should avoid kind of encouraging deviance to preserve social order. It shouldn't be kind of encouraging people to kind of step outside of the rules too much. This particularly relates to the idea of the public sphere, that the media in this way is kind of a disseminator of information that in a healthy public sphere will have good knowledge to be able to kind of debate things and make good policy and get things to work efficiently. So in this sense, from the functionalist point of view, the media helps to create an informed citizenry. From the more conflict side though, there's a kind of argument that the media reflects only kind of powerful ruling class interests. Now why is that? It's because, the ruling class own the media. So this is particularly through a nexus between government and business, and that the argument here is that therefore that in the media, really only kind of certain perspectives get the light of day. This tends to reflect the worldview and the tastes and the orientations to the world of the privileged. So from this point of view, the media aids in the oppression and the keeping down of working class. It's something that kind of halts a kind of working class revolution. So from a conflict point of view then, much of the entertainment in terms of pop culture that we look at is kind of mindless. It distracts us from what we should be really concerned with, which is the unfair conditions of the labour market and forms of exploitation and alienation. So from that perspective, ownership of the media is really important. Antonio Gramsci coined the term of hegemony, which is, I think, quite useful for thinking about this. Hegemony is this idea that the ruling class can't necessarily just kind of take all the time from the working class. They need to kind of give a little bit, otherwise there may be a revolution. And so there's kind of struggles that go on, and sometimes the ruling class need to give some things up to keep the working class satisfied. Hegemonic analysis of the media kind of takes this on board, points out that in many ways, the news media and things like that tend to portray things from a ruling class point of view, but then there's also the kind of forms of entertainment as well that kind of help us keep us sedated in that sense. In Australia, there's one of the highest concentrations of media in the world. Murdoch and Nine Entertainment pretty much dominate the landscape. There's not a lot of competition, but at the same time, we are a kind of rare country that has, nationally provided media as well, with the ABC and the SBS. So there's a kind of map here. I won't kind of go into that too much. You can look at that yourself in your own time. But it kind of shows a snapshot of who owns what. So ownership's really important, and other sociological concepts get us to think a little bit about the kind of, I suppose, the how of these kind of representations of ruling class and powerful points of view. One way of thinking about this is through Stanley Cohen's idea of moral panic, that was developed when he did an analysis of a kind of famous riot on Brighton Beach in the 60s between the so-called mods and the rockers. And this is represented in the film Quadrophenia, if anyone's seen that. What Cohen thought was that there was a lot of sensationalism going on here. Things were exaggerated. He was concerned about what that meant, and he developed this process that he observed that the way the media works. So something happens, like a fight on the beach between two different sets of spectacular-looking young people, and this is the initial problem is kind of represented. It tends to be shown in the media in sensationalist, dramatised ways. It escalates. Stereotypes are presented, but then it kind of amplifies. Experts come out with initial solutions. There's societal reactions. What he calls the moral entrepreneurs come out of the and start talking on the media about how to control these things, and they can be, cops, teachers, politicians, priests, all kinds of experts. What often happens here is there's a kind of designated kind of definition of deviance, and this tends to always end up with the kind of call for more laws, more legal constraints. What can then happen too is the people were then labelled, and you can kind of hark back here and think a little bit about the work of Stanley Cohen that I talked about. Howard Becker that I talked about in previous weeks. The offenders then often don't like the way they've been presented and then react against it. But then this reaction confirms all the kind of stereotypical, sensationalist way they've been represented previously. So again, there's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy here. So moral panics, they're where Cohen thought they were episodic, they would happen every now and then. There'd be a moral panic about this, and we go through that process, and then there'd be another one. And today, it seems that more that these is just like the permanent state of the media, and there's kind of multiple ones going on at once. So, in many ways, rather than moral panic theory being a critical theory about the media now, it seems as much an instruction manual for how journalists do their job. So, whether it's every now and then now, maybe we're in a permanent state. I've got a link there to what I think is almost a perfect encapsulation of a moral panic story on the old Today Tonight from years ago, and have a look at the content warnings there. And what that is that it's a story about young emo girls, a subculture that committed suicide, and then there's this kind of a bunch of experts talk about how this was the subculture's fault. Again, this relates, I think, back to many of the things I was talking about in previous weeks, around things like mental health and society in general. So I think that's a really good example of a moral panicky story, where there's kind of a reverse blame given, and we'll talk a little bit about why subcultures aren't really the cause of those things later on in this lecture. Another way of thinking about the media is through the idea of simulations and simulacra and hyperreality. This comes out of the work of the French theorist Jean Baudrillard. And what Baudrillard and others like him started to write about the media is that really the media no longer reflects a reality. You can't really look at the media and say a news event and see the truth. Really, you're only seeing a representation of things. Now, that's kind of seems a bit banal, really. That's fairly obvious, I suppose. But what the development of this critical media studies kind of does is it points out then that it's not just the problem in terms of a distortion of reality from the media to reality itself, is that what happens now is much of the media that we consume is based on other kinds of media, and there's this kind of mirror effect going on. That there's no original anymore and everything's based on a previous media story. And this means we kind of therefore are relying on other media to make our current media. The example I used to explain this is that, and this is in the introduction to a book that Baudrillard wrote called The Gulf War Did Not Take Place, where there's a kind of 24/7 news channel in America, I think it was CNN, crosses over to Kuwait, where many of the journalists were stationed to report on the Gulf War in 1991. And it's one of those moments where it's live television and the person wasn't quite ready, and they turn around and you can see that the journalist is watching television to get information to report back to a television station in the US. So for the likes of Baudrillard, these kind of instances and the way that kind of popular film becomes a way that people kind of learn about history. I mean, I think most of the things I know about America probably came through The Simpsons. The blurriness between, truth, history, reality, and the way the media kind of puts all these things on a kind of even plane rather than distinguishing them between them means we live in what he calls a simulacra. It's impossible for us to escape, and we're kind of stuck in this kind of hyper reality. Interestingly, though, for Baudrillard, he doesn't necessarily see this as a bad thing. He says this is what the masses want. We like being kind of switched off from reality because reality is quite depressing. In more recent times, when we talk about media, we tend to talk much more about social media and the internet. So today, as we've looked at in the weeks on globalization, it's seen that capitalism today is as much about the mode of production of producing and controlling information. It is about controlling and producing things and consumer products. So, the social media giants, everyone knows who they are. These things are now the biggest companies in the world, alongside the companies that, mine oil and gas and make cars, and health, finance, commodities, and security companies. Importantly, this means that rather than having to consume media almost by making the time for it, like you had to kind of sit on the couch to watch TV, or pick up the newspaper and concentrate on reading it, and go over to the record player and put something on. Really, we're just carrying media around with us 24/7 now in our phones. We're immersed in it. There's a kind of digital leash to this kind of stuff. So we'll look at this in much more detail later in the course when I do the whole week on digital media. So to conclude this section, is the media good or bad? Really, that's a wrong question. Sociologists aren't necessarily thinking along those terms. And cultural sociologists, which is kind of somewhere between the functional and the critical, tend to be more ambivalent. They kind of point out that there's different aspects of media and pop culture going on at all time. It's not necessarily always, sensationalist or, keeping us cultural dupes. There's other kind of more subversive or resistive media, forms of pop culture. So in this sense, the media is very important to understanding people's day-to-day lives. But again, it's not this kind of monolithic thing. There's lots of distinctions and different things going on within it. So in the next couple of videos, I'll be presenting aspects of that. Firstly, presenting the ideas of the Frankfurt School, who talk about media as ideology. And in the last section, I'll be talking about the work of on subcultures and semiotics that give individuals a little bit more freedom and autonomy when it comes to thinking about consumption of pop culture and media.